So we're going to talk about standardization briefly, and talking about standardization reminds me, when Karen asked me to do this, it reminded me immediately of my my first ever job when I cut my teeth as a tsetse fly ecologist and set off to Zambia working for the Overseas Development Administration to collect tsetse flies. And I arrived there completely wet behind the ears, thinking that we were going to standardize all of these tsetse and trypanosomiasis collection procedures across the region. And of course, I met with brick walls everywhere I tried to do this, and it became the S word. It was never mentioned at dinner parties. And so I'm well aware of the problems that we have with standardizing data and the pushback there is against standardizing data collection procedures and you know, by people who've been doing their own things in their own way for very good reasons for plenty of time. And one thing that I did manage to get people to do is to record latitudes and longitudes on the tsetse survey sheets, and that reminds me of a set of data that's sort of naturally become standardized very easily over time, and this is geographic data. And whereas it used to be very complex and you used to have to set up datums to record GPS coordinates, you know, in the good old days when a GPS was a Magellan that was the size of a house brick and cost about £1,000, and GIS systems much more complex, and we had to invest a lot of time in transforming map projections to make maps compatible with one another. And that's all just naturally emerged into a system where it's completely seamless, and nobody even realizes that you know, that there are complexities underlying the way that map data are represented nowadays. And everyone sees that with, you know, when they're following Google Maps on their phones. So what we're going to talk about here is what could be standardized, what should be standardized, what doesn't need to be because it's sort of naturally standardized. And so what we'll do is initially go very briefly through the panel here, who will each introduce themselves. I won't waste time doing that. And they'll talk about their experiences and thoughts about standardization, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion from the floor. So I think we just go straight along the line here and start with you, Steve.
30 seconds, 5 minutes. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I guess the question is, what are we trying to achieve by standardization? I think the purpose of what we actually want is not standardization, but interoperability, and that's interoperability between data sources and data types is the big question facing every community on the planet. I mean, and we want to do that not just because, you know, we want you know, a Gates project on chickens to be able to share data with a Gates project on cows. We want to be able to bring in completely different data types like climate data, weather data, soil type data. I think there's this vision of a sort of interoperable universe of data where we can fish and pull out interrelated data types. And I hate to say it, but standardization is not going to achieve that. It is absolutely impossible to standardize everything, and that's like a 30-year-old approach to the problem. The current way of thinking is completely different. There are some clear anchor points, and as Tim says, GPS, latitude and longitude is one of those obvious anchor points at which you can anchor a particular datum. But achieving interoperability using current technology is a very different way of going about this, and I think that's where we should be. We should not be focusing on standardizing for the sake of it. We should be asking what we want to achieve through standardization.
Thanks, Steve. That was a great opening. I've talking about experiences. I've had mixed experiences with standardization. We tried to standardize, for example, farm household surveys and things like that. And we tried to do it since the mid-90s, actually, trying to get people to collect standard information and everything. And to be honest, those early attempts failed because they were way too rigid. And we tried to collect basically too much data, too many data fields. And what we concluded is that at the end of the day, you can collect a a small set that is very, very easy to collect, which is farm sizes and number of people and some basic characteristics. But ultimately, everybody wants to do the survey for very, very different reasons. So you actually need to end up with much more flexible and quick approaches. And Mark will present later one of these approaches that has moved us in the right direction. On the other hand, there are some very good examples of standardization. For example, crop modelers have standardized input files between themselves since the late 80s. And they did this simply to be able to share experimental data as inputs. This all started in Wageningen with ICASA. There used to be an international consortium for agricultural systems applications. And all the crop modelers agreed on the same input files, same naming of variables, and trying to produce the same kind of output files so that they could compare models and advance the science. And that was a very, very useful exercise that we tried to do then for livestock and tried to do for the systems and everything. And we found that, well, no, look, things start getting too complicated when you really try to do that. It helped for a specific purpose. It advanced the crop modeling work, but it was very difficult to engage in a more broad discussion.
Thanks. I'm Carl Rich from ILRI, based in here. In my experience, I've in a value chain in a more qualitative space. And I think, one of the challenges that we face there is when we go from, quantitative data, yes, no, looking at longitude, latitude, all those kinds of things, what's production, to things that are a bit more narrative-based, more contextual. It gets even more challenging in terms of how we actually standardize things. And I think whenever we develop a survey protocol or a checklist or a key informant interview type of protocol, these things are everyone starts from scratch, it seems, that we never have a standard way of actually doing that. And whether we need to or not, I don't know. I think maybe, Steve's point about interoperability and being able to use that information to inform other kinds of modeling or data analysis efforts is probably more important than a standard tool as such. I guess the other issue, and I think, putting on our academic hats, is that is standardization too much of a straitjacket in terms of advancing science? Because if we're all doing the same kinds of things, then where does the innovation come in terms of new methods, new ideas, and so on? And so I think, again, it gets in terms of how we actually use this information more than anything else.
Yeah, I think the point about how information is used really is critical, because that is going to drive differences in what you collect and how you collect it. From my particular experience, it's more at the global economic modeling level. So Mario talked about the crop modelers being quite far along in terms of standardized data. The global economic models are not so much. We do take advantage of some of the data sets and the projections that have been developed as part of the IPCC process, the shared socioeconomic pathways and the representative concentration pathways and so forth, just for some specific variables, like population and income, for example. Many other things, changes in dietary preferences, land use, and so forth, we've not been able to do the same sort of thing. One area in particular in relation to livestock that we're trying to improve for the impact model that I think, Dolapo, you introduced yesterday on my behalf, thanks for that, is to get a much better sense of the non-cereal feeds, which we don't capture in impact. So prices of pasture and stover and so forth, things which we don't incorporate, and that really limits our ability to look at differences in production systems and environmental impact and so forth. And for that, we're working with Carl and Dolapo to try and find those data where they exist, to try and get a sense of where the existing data can be used in neighboring countries or for similar commodities, just to try and extend our ability to incorporate that type of commodity that's missing in our current analysis.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think that there's very much else left for me to say, but I'll try and talk a little bit about some of my experiences. So I've been working, as Keith mentioned, with the global economic models, and essentially what we end up doing a lot is taking data that others have collected for completely different purposes and trying to fit them to our purpose, which is trying to take surveys, trying to take results from biological experiments, trying to take data about land use all over the world and to fit these into making different types of like global databases. And you can imagine that this is really challenging. The spatial referencing definitely helps. And I would say that in addition to that, if you could put a timestamp on the data that you collect, that really helps, because when we see prices for sorghum stover in India, for example, we want to know what season are we looking at, and that definitely helps on the one hand. In terms of like the feeds data that Keith spoke about, so what we're finding is you get a lot of experimental data from all over. And in this case, I think an approach like what the crop modelers have done might actually help, because we get this data on feeds, we get prices that we can use a bit of georeferencing to figure out, and the time and space stamp. And then we get the laboratory analysis, and one person is reporting total digestible nutrients, and the other one is reporting in vitro, what's that called? Digestibility, yes, in vitro digestibility. And I would need to find at this meeting some point where I can sit with Mario and see, when I see these types of things, how can I relate them? Because we need that for these databases that Keith spoke about. So that's a few of the slight changes that going forward we might want to talk to the people who collect that sort of data and say, it helps us, even though that's not what you want to use your data for, but it's a little bit extra that you may need to do, but it does help for being able to use this data for a lot of other different purposes. And the same thing for some of the surveys. We've used DHS data, we've used, I have not used LSMS, but a lot of like the farm household surveys, and somebody's collecting 24-hour recall data, and which is very helpful for some purposes. But as we go forward and we're trying to model impacts and trying to model the trade-offs between socioeconomic impacts and environmental impacts, we probably need a lot more hard numbers. And so there may need to be an evolution in how some of this data is collected. Even if you say, did you feed chicken to your child? Was it a handful of chicken, or was it, a cup of milk? That might help. So for those who collect those kinds of data, it might be useful to start talking about, being able to quantify some of that stuff. It's not so much saying that you're collecting the wrong data. It's just saying if we want to be able to do these types of analysis together in going forward, then maybe even the way you collect the household surveys might need to evolve a little bit. So I think that's my contribution.
Thanks, Dolapo. You said there wasn't anything you could add, but there's lots to add. And so Dolapo's spoken about the importance of being able to use data that were collected for other reasons. Keith's talked about the sort of global models, and Carl's spoken about more qualitative data and how tricky that is to standardize and analyze and so on. And Mario's given some good examples about the crop modeling data and the household survey data. And Steve has sort of given us a big data perspective, this idea of bringing all these diverse data sets together. So it's open to the floor for anyone who has a comment.
Ask a question back to the panel around use of standardized metrics. So yesterday, we talked about this use of indicators, and then the last comment about the nutrition community reminded me. So of like in certain communities, like in the nutrition community, there are standard measures for dietary diversity, right? Like Fanta has come up with 24-hour recall to measure women's dietary diversity. And there's a standard methodology that's used to measure this concept, right? And so that can be embedded into data collection instruments and things like that, allows for comparability. At IFPRI, they've been quite involved with developing the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. There's quite a lot of work that has gone, the community has come together to really develop these standard measures in these metrics. And I'm not familiar with, and maybe I know about it more, but if there are any standard measures like that in the livestock community, and if there is the potential to develop, or if there are any areas where we could think about, standard metrics and standard methodologies to capture specific concepts that could be adopted by the community. And maybe if anyone has experience with that, like attempts in the past, and maybe why that hasn't worked, or specific areas where you think that there might be an opportunity to develop something like that, I'd love to hear about it.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I'm certainly aware there are methods for sort of recording on a website a pipeline of processes where data goes in and you apply a set of standard rules and you come out with a metric, such as the sort of nutritional metrics you're talking about. But I think the fundamental problem here is that that any standard, any method of determining anything you like is going to be different tomorrow, and it's going to change, and ideas are going to change. We are trying to integrate and combine data at the wrong level. What you're talking about is an emergent property of the underlying core data, and that's true of so many different things. I mean, trivial things like distance to market. Actually, what you would never want to share distance. Some metric of distance between this farmer and the market. What you would want to share is the latitude, longitude, and the date, and then you can keep recomputing that and try different ways of doing it. And as long as we're combining data at a sort of intermediate level, we're never going to get true sustainable interoperability. We've got to resynthesize from the source data.
Just a very quick addition to that. Look, there are some standards in the way that we deal with some of the productivity measurements. But in reality, at the system level or beyond, for the sector, we have very little. For example, in terms of productivity, milk standardized to 305 days of lactation and things like that. Those things have been done by animal productionists for quite a while. So there's a range of productivity parameters that we can relate to. But yes, at the sector level, there is no standard measure.
Carl, very quickly.
Yeah,
we'll move on.
Yeah, just to follow up on Mario's point in particular. I mean, in the value chain area, we've been struggling with this quite a bit. So when you move beyond the sector to the whole chain, at ILRI and with PIM and IFPRI and others, we've been trying to develop various metrics for looking at value chain performance, and it's been a really slow haul. And so if we're looking at areas where there might be potential for future engagement, that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, that's good. Cara, you've been chomping at the bit. Do you want to talk about this, or making a new point? As a separate point, or to continue this? Okay. Well, let me just. Andrew is there. Yeah, I see. Steve, do you want to add to this discussion? A separate thing. So, sorry, Andrew, and then Cara, and then Steve. Let's move on.
It goes back to Steve's original point about interoperability. I just wonder whether there is a case for some standards, but at the metadata level. And it's more around the rigor there to help facilitate interoperability. And I think it came up in the point around just even dates, knowing when the data was collected in some sort of metadata standard would at least help. And it's probably not even so much a standard, it's just some improved rigor around just describing metadata that can help facilitate that interoperability.
Thanks, Andrew. Cara, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think it sort of fits with what Andrew was just saying. So it seems not necessarily the data needs to be standard, but just that you're missing some data, so you don't even have the units or the times to start with. I just struggle with what the incentive is for people to use standards. I come from a GLP, GCP background, you know, where there's SOPs, there's standards for every unit, and if you don't oblige and you know submit a study to the FDA, it'll get kicked out the door and they won't even look at it unless you're using standard units. But I can't see in this environment the incentive for individual projects to do that and how you would encourage that. But it seems to be just, you know, as Andrew said, that if people just actually recorded the units they did use, whatever they were, then there would be a chance to work with that. So it could be missing data rather than standardizing it.
I think one of the important things about in our sort of work about standardization is that it enables, and this is a point that Dolapo was making, is that it enables data to be used for things that it wasn't necessarily originally intended to be used for. So I mean you know, there's so much value if data can be used and reused and put to different applications, and that's all you know, an important part of what the big data movement is putting together diverse data sources that weren't necessarily collected for the purpose they're being put to. Inamo, Steve, you were wanting to mention something.
Yeah, I missed the beginning of the session. Maybe I missed something. You were talking about diverse data sources. I just want to go back to kind of the discussions we've been having for the last couple of years on kind of working together on sort of the macro level modeling. I mean, maybe I should have brought this up when the modeling group presented, but you know, we've had discussions going way back, starting even with December 2016 meeting we had in Nairobi, where many of the same people were involved, and it's about working together with FAO, IFPRI, CSIRO, with Marius, to really kind of, you know, because we have these parallel streams of sort of modeling efforts going on. And we had the report back of the meeting in May, right, Tim? And but there didn't seem sort of a clear way forward, and it seems like that issue has sort of dropped off the agenda and is kind of sort of being replaced now by this effort with GalFnet to do the sort of Tanzania, India modeling. But the bigger picture stuff, I feel like, is falling through the cracks. And I mean, if this initiative, this platform can't sort of coordinate that, I mean, who can? And I think it needs to go back on the agenda. I thought there was a proposal that was actually submitted, Tim, earlier this year after the Naivasha meeting on how to kind of do that. I just wanted to see, can we move that forward? My understanding, it may be an issue of sharing the toys nicely in the sandbox, as some have said, you know, but, you know, how can we kind of move that forward? Yeah.
No, fair point, Steve. But I don't think that has been replaced by that other working group. I think the working group exists, but we need to redefine it. And I think that the three of us will probably be fairly key in taking that forward. And we'll bring, we'll get back to the table with that proposal. I think we'll probably develop something quite different that'll work out how to take that working group forwards within this forum. I certainly hope that will be the case, and it's certainly not been forgotten or replaced. We want to get back onto the case of working what we can do.
Can I change the topic slightly? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. No. I mean, it's going back to the higher level of how are we dealing with data and operability and all these issues. So here you have a bunch of economists, livestock scientists, geneticists, and in here there's absolutely not one single data scientist in the modern take of what a data scientist is. So look, we will continue talking like Neanderthals around the topic unless we really start engaging with a bunch of 28-somethings and 30-somethings that come from the data, from the big data or whatever you want to call it, to advance on this topic. Because the reality is that if we're still thinking that we need to standard. Jonathan, no offense, but if the level of the conversation is whether we need to standardize a TLU or not, look, we're not making progress, and that's the reality. And for a group called Livestock Data for Decisions, not to have a single proper modern data person, look, we're just even talking to ourselves. Sorry, I just had to. Yes. I just have to rant.
Thank you, Mario. I was thinking of a polite way to say that, but it was much better to use not to be polite. I completely agree. I actually saying, imagine this was a meeting called Molecular Biology for Vaccines, and there wasn't a single person in the room who knew how to do a PCR or design a CRISPR guide. That's kind of where we are now. We're talking about data without any data expertise, that's why we end up talking in the wrong level and the wrong. We don't talk about the fundamentals of a data platform. We start trying to imagine data talking at intermediate levels that we don't fully understand. I completely agree.
Yep. Point very well made.
No, I just wanted to make a comment. Last year, I was a meeting on linked open data, and there were the publishing houses there, and they were very behind people publishing their data along with their publication. But I'm guessing it's something that doesn't particularly happen in this sector, where people, along with the journal, do actually publish their data. And if you were publishing your data, you would expect that there would be a certain amount of consistency in the type of data that other people could look at it.
I think that's reasonable. I think, Jonathan, you wanted to just defend yourself.
No, I think it's a fair point, but you're saying to me that actually we're okay, and I don't think we are okay. So we don't have a document that clearly states that kind of methodology. So we're talking about lots of detailed things, but if we can't actually define a core issue, which is actually how many animals do we have, or what do they look like, which species are they, in which systems, then what basis do we have to start talking about standardization of anything? So when you start doing modeling and we start doing complex modeling of economic impact, and actually we can't define whether it's one sort of chicken or another, or one sort of meat or another, then that's actually quite an important fundamental issue. What the livestock unit documents? Okay, all right. So I stand corrected.
Add to it. I mean, they exist. There are numbers that we use, but they're totally inadequate, not detailed enough by any means, I think. Andy, sorry, you were standing up before. Let me.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct one statement that there are no data scientists here. Louise actually is a data scientist, one of the valued SEBI team. So I just wanted to point that out.
Very well, and apologies to Louise. Yeah.
Well, the first question, I mean, to probably Steve and Mario, why you accepted to be a panel member if you think that you are not the right person to discuss data standardization? I'm sorry, I mean, yeah, is it? No, I'm not asking for that, but you know, having said that, okay, at the system level, Mario and probably Steve, what are the minimum standard we need to follow whenever we collect data at the system level? I know productivity, production level, in our own right, I mean, for different species, we have standards. Yes, they need to be refined. We need to agree on those standards, but at a system level or at an intermediate level, what are the basic standards you recommend, I mean, we biologists to follow?
You want to say something?
Look, it will depend on the kind of data that we need for a specific purpose. And that's the whole point of Steve. If you start creating very rigid standards, what will happen is that tomorrow you will need something else, and the day after you'll need something else, and the standards will actually there will be an enormous amount of maintenance to do if we continue with that approach. While if you focus on interoperability, you have something that it can actually be driven forward in a more everything would be a lot easier to update as needed. The problem that we face now, and this is something related to what Carol was saying, it's about the incentives too. I worked for more than 10 years trying to find standards for household level data because of that basic premise that, well, you know, you go to the Kenyan highlands and you have 5 centers going to the same farms, collecting basically the same kind of information. So if you try to apply common sense, you say, well, why don't we just do one survey, or at least standardize the names of the variables and so on? And it sounds very obvious. And you know, it's very, very difficult because people really want to do very different things with the data. They want to focus on very specific aspects. One comes from an agroforestry perspective, then we were coming from a livestock perspective. So the focus on the look, at one point we thought, well, why don't we do the mother of the surveys so that we do it once and everybody can use the same survey? But you know, the difficulties of collecting information at the farm level. Are you going to go to a farm the whole day to interview the farmer? No. So at the end of the day, there's practical issues that prevent you from achieving the comprehensiveness that you would like in having the survey that will actually give you that opportunity. So we end up doing our own things. What are the kinds of things that were always collected? Well, typical things are the farm sizes, that the structural variables are quite easy, but then the management needs to be depending on the problem.
Yeah. Now we have a question or a comment from the live stream, so let's quickly deal with that first. Sorry? Well, let's leave that topic. Let's carry on with the live stream.
So we have a few followers for this session, and we have a question from Ha Dong, who is from the Vietnam National University of Agriculture, and they want to know about how data standards reflect the dynamic of combining quantitative and qualitative data, particularly at multiple levels of analysis. So if the panel has experience with this, tips, challenges, so forth.
Is that something you could comment on?
Perhaps on the qualitative side. I mean, the short answer, it's a mess. I mean, trying to standardize qualitative information, and especially, I mean, getting to Marta's point again in terms of how we actually ask for the data, and how we actually obtain the data, and all these kinds of ways of trying to get information in a qualitative sense. I mean, that's the Wild West. And I think that, and I mean, I think just trying to figure out what common ways of trying to, and once we even have the information, how we actually process and analyze and use that information, it's the same. So moving towards something that's, I mean, do we necessarily need to standardize that? I don't know. But I think if we can find ways that we actually use that information and for multiple purposes, that's probably a better way of looking at this, as FC has mentioned, rather than trying to get everyone to be straitjacketed in one way of doing things. Because I think in a social science context, there's a lot of nuance there. I think standardization would really put a straitjacket on.
Thanks, Steve. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah. And again, this is a place where modern computer science and machine learning and that sort of approach can help us. It doesn't make an artificial category between quantitative data and qualitative data. You know, when Google send me ads because they've decided today I'm interested in whatever it is that I've been Googling on my phone, it's not as if they run an analysis and says, aha, Steve is interested this week. Steve cares about Ethiopian coffee. They're constantly refining their algorithm, constantly going back to the source data and deciding, what's the best way to interact with me, and that's how we need to be doing it.
Roy, you've been waiting to ask something for a while, I think.
Yep, so I'm coming from the data collection standpoint here, and yes, I'm looking at the panel, and there is an awful lot of modelers there, and I'm just thinking back to a previous life as a climate scientist, and there was this constant battle between modelers and measurers. The measurers would say, we need more models. The modelers, we need more measures. But it was this two-way process that actually drove innovation and actually moved forward. Yes, it was quite painful at times, but I'm just slightly worried that if it comes down to a wish list from modelers of what they want from data collectors, if that came to me, some of the stuff I might look at and say, yeah, sure, we can incorporate that in our surveys. Other things, I'd probably just chuck it out if it wasn't going to be relevant to what we were doing. So I think if we can have that wider community buy-in and get data collectors more involved in things, and that's actually how we could really begin to start this process, because there's going to be a process at the end of the day. We're not going to solve it today.
Hannah, sorry, I think you were wanting to say something.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's two really important concepts that we're talking about. One is around standardization of metrics, and then like data standards that allow for interoperability, data sharing and data use. And to me, those are two very different things. One enables the other, and they're two different questions. So from the foundation's perspective, we've just revamped our data access policy and requiring that all data that are produced through our investments need to follow the FAIR data principles, which are that they need to be findable. Help me out here, Steve. I is integratable. No, wait. Oh, A comes next. Yeah, accessible, findable, accessible, interoperable. I don't even remember what they are off the top of my head. Sorry, I can look it up. But essentially, the FAIR data principles that allow for interoperability, they allow for sharing. It's metadata formats, it's the ontologies, the formats of how data can be exchanged, machine readable. That's very much about the interoperability of data. And then the standardization of metrics is something that's very different. And that's also critically important to the foundation especially from a monitoring and evaluation perspective. So as I presented yesterday, we have a core set of indicators that actually we expect all of our programs to report on. And that is required because we need to be able to compare and we need to be able to aggregate, again, the impact of our investments. So there are two fundamentally different questions, and I think both are really important, and that there is, I think that we're conflating the two a bit in this discussion, and that we might need to separate those two out because we have a diverse audience here as well.
Thanks, Hannah. I think that's a very, very good point that we all probably agree with. Any other questions, Alex?
Thanks. Similarly, actually, I come from a GCP GLP background, and there's some interesting things that happen there in how standards were created and how they were mandated and all of that. And I think for me, it boiled down to the question of what do you want to achieve? And I think that's the question for LD4D as a community, is what are the current challenges with data? Because I don't think you can just solve the problem if you haven't defined it well enough. So the question is, what are the issues that you're facing? Because once you know that, I think then you can determine whether it is a standard, it's an ontology, it's this or that. How do you then solve that problem? I think that's the first question that this community needs to think about.
Yeah, good point. Any other?
Very quickly, perhaps for the next meeting, it would be quite interesting to see how, I don't know, how other sectors or other groups do it in different disciplines, just to see if we can learn from some of from others. Yeah, and obviously, Luis, I apologize to you, but look, to be one in this sea of livestock data for decisions, we need more data scientists. It's the point I'd like to make.
So you said, any use this? Sorry, Louis.
I mean, my background is more data integration, but more like financial telecom systems. And so, like, if you're doing an international payment, there's a SWIFT standard, so there's not really much of a discussion. And I guess it comes down to what Alex was saying about what is the incentive of actually using standards. I would have thought it's about sharing data and bringing data sets together. And Steve's talking about interoperability. But I still think there's got to be something that maps things, some common language, even if you call your data the same thing. Something, you can't just magically, I mean, we're looking at disease data and disease names different for the same thing. And so we've got a mapper. So but how you coordinate that as a community is a challenge, because it's exactly what Tim was saying. Which standard do you use? Is it World Bank, FAO, other OIE? It's a big challenge.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's, you know, the big data, it relies on these linchpins that pull things together, whatever they are, whether they're geographic coordinates or words in your Google searching or whatever they are. They, you know, you do need these things that pull things together, and that's sort of fundamental. So the new voice over there.
Yeah, just to share the experience of the OIE in sharing information about animal health data. We, as you know, we are building the new platform, the Weibe Plus, and we face the problem. We try to integrate our platform, the ADIS, the Animal Disease Notification System from the European Union, and we face a lot of problem in trying to get the same information. So what we are doing now is to create a sort of common platform. We had a 1 year discussion how to standardize the different fields of the data that the European Union and the member countries of the OIE are collecting. And what we are doing now, we are in the phase of creating this common data entry point for European Union and for the member. Basically, the member countries are member country of the OIE, member country of the European Union. So now they have a unique. They will have a unique entry point to send us the information, and the information will be shared to both European Union and the OIE.
Jonathan, I think you wanted to say something quickly, and then we should think about wrapping up.
Yeah, just back to that disease issue. We don't have a disease classification system for animal health, which is something that OIE are working on, and that's obviously important because coding that is going to be absolutely vital. So, you know, do we go on symptoms? Do we go on diagnoses? Do we look at impact? There's a whole range of things we've got to be quite clear on with regards to taking that forward. And with regards to clarity of issues, what do we actually need? I'd like to see something around the basis of what are our current investments in animals, which needs us to measure how many animals we've got, their biomass, their value in different societies. When we're looking at the value chain, what's the value added across the value chain for the different actors in that process? And what's the impact on the consumer in terms of affordability and accessibility of key nutrients? I just think there are things we can be very clear about. I understand that there are complex issues with regards to data, but I think we need to be very clear about the metrics we actually want to derive from that process to report back to the donors with some degree of clarity about what we're trying to achieve.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's clearly a very complex issue, isn't it? And we can't hope to deal with it in its entirety. But we probably ought to think about how to take forward the discussion, and it may be something for Sebi. So maybe we could ask Sebi to give us some final thoughts on whether it's something that might be taken, or maybe we need a working group to come up with some sort of document deciding on which sorts of things we might be able to standardize, what the objectives would be, what we mean by sort of standard procedures versus standard data formats. And so, you know, it's clearly an important thing that we need to clarify. And there are, you know, it's a very diverse topic. So the question is for Sebi, really, I think, now, for us as a community, for the LD4D community, which is probably the correct terminology, to decide how to go forward. So maybe Karen, you could say something.
Well, thank you for the very lively discussion. There's obviously quite a lot of interest in the room around this topic, so it was good to hear so many points of view. and there's a lot of food for thought. We do have the opportunity to have a working group discussion on this in the afternoon, and maybe if those people who are interested could get together and just maybe chart out what are the key things that we could deliver in maybe a workshop or a working group to move this area of work forward. There was also the question of data scientists, and if we were to include more data scientists in this group, what would they look like and who would they be? Or whether we have a separate working group which includes those data scientists to deal with these issues, because they may not be terribly interested in the rest of our discussions. So I think definitely there's a lot to chew over the coffee break, and maybe we have a working group at the end of the day on this.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen, and thanks very much for all your lively discussion, and thank you very much to the panel.
Great, and thanks to Tim for leading that session. We break for coffee and we resume at 10:30.